The morning Iris Calloway showed up at the Dunbar Ranch gate with 2 suitcases and a cast-iron skillet wrapped in a dish towel, nobody came out to greet her. Not her new husband, not his ranch hand, not even the dog. She stood there in the August heat with dust settling on her shoes, and the sun already mean overhead, and she told herself this was fine. She had known what she was walking into. Her mother had warned her. Her cousin Bet had warned her twice. But Iris had made her decision the way she made most decisions. Quietly, after thinking it through longer than anyone knew, and without asking permission from people who hadn't earned the right to give it. She picked up her suitcases and walked through the gate herself. Her husband's name was Douglas Dunbar, and he was 39 years old, which was 14 years older than Iris, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in weather for a decade, and somehow gotten more handsome for it. He ran cattle on 400 acres outside of Morrow Creek, a small town in eastern Montana that most people drove through without stopping. Douglas had been a widower for 3 years when a mutual acquaintance introduced them at a church supper in Billings. He had sat across from her and eaten 2 plates of pot roast and said almost nothing for the first hour. Then he'd said, "You made the biscuits?" She'd said she had. He'd said, "They're good." That was, she would later understand, as close to poetry as Douglas Dunbar got. They were married 4 months later in a small ceremony at the county courthouse. Iris wore a blue dress. Douglas wore his good boots. Her mother cried in the parking lot afterward and said she hoped Iris knew what she was doing. Iris said she did. She was not entirely sure that was true. What she learned in the first weeks at the ranch was this. Douglas was a man who ran a tight operation and expected the same from everyone around him. The cattle were healthy. The fences were maintained. The books were kept in a green ledger on the desk in the office, and they balanced to the penny every month. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. But he had a way of looking at things and people and measuring them against some internal standard that he never fully explained, and when they fell short, his silence said everything his words didn't. He fell short on her cooking inside the first week. It wasn't a fight. It was worse than that. It was a comment delivered without heat, the way you might note that the weather had turned or a fence post needed replacing. "My first wife," he said one evening, pushing his fork through a plate of chicken and roasted vegetables. "She had a real gift for this." Iris set her glass down. She did not say anything. She finished her meal. She washed the dishes. She went to bed. But she lay there in the dark and she thought, so that's where we are. She wasn't naive about what she'd married into. She knew Douglas had loved Margaret. That was the first wife's name, Margaret, dead of a heart condition at 36. Which was its own kind of tragedy that Iris held with respect, even when it was used against her. She knew that grief made people compare. She knew that a man who had built his life around one woman for 12 years would carry the shape of her long after she was gone. What she hadn't known was how often he'd let her feel it. "You put too much salt in things," he said once. "Margaret didn't fuss with it this much," he said another time, gesturing at the herbs she'd hung to dry along the kitchen window. "Dinner doesn't need to be complicated," he said, when she made a slow-cooked lamb stew from a recipe her grandmother had written out by hand in a notebook with a purple cover. His ranch hand, a quiet man in his 50s named Boyd, ate whatever she put in front of him and thanked her every time. Boyd's opinion, she gathered, did not factor into Douglas's assessment system. Iris started keeping a separate notebook of her own. Not for recipes exactly. She knew those by heart. It was more of a record. Dates. What she'd made. What he'd said. What he hadn't said. She wasn't sure why. It felt important to write things down when they happened, so that later she couldn't talk herself out of what she remembered. She was not a woman who talked herself out of things. But she was learning that this house had a way of making her second-guess herself, and she didn't like that, and she intended to stop it before it became a habit. The cooking itself she kept doing. She made what she knew how to make, the way she knew how to make it, and she adjusted nothing for his preferences except the salt, which she reduced slightly and then not at all. She made corn chowder and venison chili and peach cobbler and sourdough bread that she started from a culture she'd been keeping alive since she was 22. She made her grandmother's biscuits, light and layered, which Boyd declared the best thing he'd eaten since his mother's table. She made pot pies with hand-rolled crust and a wild mushroom gravy that took 3 hours but was worth every one of them. Douglas ate all of it. He cleaned his plate without fail. But somewhere between eating and acknowledgement there was a wall he never came down from, and so his silence after a meal felt like something other than peace. She started cooking for Boyd. Not separately, they all ate together, but she'd look at Boyd when she put something on the table and say, "Tell me what you think of this one," and Boyd would taste it and say something real about it, something specific. "The time is just right, or there's something underneath. What is that?" And Iris would tell him, and they'd talk about it, and Douglas would eat in silence at the head of the table, like a man attending a meeting he hadn't been invited to. She told herself it didn't bother her. It bothered her. The trouble with the ranch started in October, which was late enough in the year that the grass had gone brown, and the cattle were being moved to the winter pastures. Douglas came in from a call one evening and sat down at the kitchen table without taking off his coat, which was something he never did, and Iris knew before he said a word that something had shifted. "Wellman pulled out," he said. She put the kettle on. "The grazing lease?" "All of it. The lease, the arrangement we had for spring calves, the lot." She sat down across from him. Gerald Wellman was the owner of the adjacent property, 200 acres of good grazing land that Douglas had been leasing for 11 years to supplement his own capacity. Without it, the herd he was running was too large for the land he owned. He'd have to reduce his cattle numbers or find another solution, and either option was he didn't have in a year that had already been harder than most. "Why?" she asked. "His son wants to run the land himself. New idea every season with that kid." He pulled off his hat and set it on the table. "I've got until the end of March." She didn't say "I'm sorry" because she knew he didn't want that. She said, "What are your options?" He listed them. None of them were good. Selling part of the herd would hurt the breeding program he'd built over 15 years. Taking on debt for new land was risky in a market that had been soft all year. A partnership arrangement with another rancher was possible, but would take time he might not have. She listened to all of it. She said, "All right." He looked at her. "All right? I mean, I hear you," she said. "I don't have anything to fix it tonight, but I hear you." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went out to do the evening check on the animals. Iris sat at the table a little longer, thinking. She had grown up around people who solved problems with their hands. Her father had been a practical man, not wealthy, not educated past high school, but possessed of a stubbornness in the face of difficulty that she had inherited in full. When things went wrong, you looked at what you had, not at what you didn't, and you figured out what could be made from the materials in front of you. What Iris had, she began to catalog. She had a kitchen. She had skills she'd been practicing since she was 8 years old. She had a grandmother's notebook and years of her own accumulated knowledge, and a sourdough starter that was older than her marriage. She had Boyd, who knew everyone in a 100-mile radius and had worked this land for 22 years. She had a truck. She had time. And she had something she hadn't fully recognized until she started thinking about it this way. She had a reputation, small and local, that she hadn't been paying attention to. The women at the Morrow Creek Methodist Church had been asking her for recipes since her third Sunday there. The lady at the feed store had stopped her once to ask about the bread she'd brought for the community potluck. Boyd's sister Patrice had called twice to ask about the lamb stew. Iris had answered their questions and thought nothing of it and moved on. Now she started thinking about it differently. She didn't tell Douglas what she was planning. She wasn't sure she could explain it in a way that wouldn't sound small, or worse, like she was trying to fix something that was his problem to fix. She just started doing. She baked bread on Tuesday mornings and took 2 extra loaves to the feed store, where Judy, who ran the counter, had a standing offer to sell local goods on a little table by the window. She brought a jar of her blackberry preserve alongside it and priced them both herself. The first week, both loaves sold before noon. She baked more. She added a second preserve, cherry from a case of cherries Boyd's sister had brought over in July, and that Iris had put up herself in 48 jars that now lined the pantry shelves. She added a small card with her name and the ranch name on it. Dunbar Ranch, Morrow Creek, and below it, handmade, small batch, ask at the counter. Judy called her by the end of the second week. "People are asking if you do special orders." Iris said she might. She went home and made a list. By December, she had 12 regular customers for bread. By January, she had added a weekly pie to the rotation, 2 flavors, made to order, picked up at the feed store Thursday afternoons, and the waiting list for a standing order was 6 people long. A restaurant in the next town, a place called the Copper Post that served dinner on weekends, called Boyd's sister, who called Boyd, who told Iris that the chef wanted to know if she could supply dinner rolls on a regular basis. She said yes. She said yes to all of it, carefully, 1 order at a time, keeping the numbers in a separate ledger she bought at the hardware store for $2. A red ledger, not a green one. She didn't know why that felt important, but it did. She was making money. Not a lot at first, $40 here, $60 there. but by February it had grown into something that had shape and weight to it. She sat at the kitchen table on a cold Sunday morning, while Douglas was out checking the fences, and she added up the columns. $840 in 3 months. From bread, pie, preserves, and dinner rolls. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she turned to a fresh page and started writing down what she thought she could do if she pushed it. What she had not counted on was the Morrow Creek Founders' Dinner. It was an annual event held in late February, a fundraiser for the County Historical Society, a catered dinner for 200 people, the kind of event that required a venue and a menu and a team, and that had been handled for the last 9 years by a catering company out of Billings. That year, the catering company canceled 3 weeks out due to a fire at their facility. Iris found out from Judy, who heard it from the woman who ran the Historical Society, who was at that moment calling around in something close to panic. "She needs someone to cater a dinner for 200, Judy said over the phone. "February 22nd. That's 3 weeks, Iris said. "You think you could?" Iris was quiet for a moment. "I'd need help," she said. "Patrice cooks," Judy said immediately. "And Linda Marsh. You know Linda. She used to run the diner. She's retired now, but she'd do it in a heartbeat if you asked her," Iris asked. Both of them said yes before she'd finished the sentence. She spent the rest of that evening building a menu on the back of an envelope: beef brisket, roasted root vegetables, skillet cornbread, green bean salad, 3 kinds of pie, and in the morning she called the Historical Society and gave them a price. The woman said, "Can you really do this?" Iris said yes. She was not uncertain when she said it. She did not tell Douglas she was catering a dinner for 200 people. She told him she was helping out with a community event. This was true. She simply left out the scope of it. The 2 weeks before the dinner were the hardest of her adult life, and also, in a way she would only understand afterward, the clearest. She baked bread every morning starting at 4:30. She drove to the butcher in Harlan twice for the brisket. She borrowed 3 large roasters from the Methodist church and 2 card tables from the school. Patrice handled the vegetable prep with an efficiency that Iris admired purely and completely. Linda Marsh, who was 64 and had the energy of a woman half that age, ran the cornbread operation out of her own kitchen and delivered it in the back of her Subaru in pans stacked to the ceiling. On the evening of the 22nd, Iris stood in the back of the Morrow Creek Community Hall and watched 200 people eat the food she and Patrice and Linda had made, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter than that, something that sat low and steady in the chest like a good fire, the particular satisfaction of having made something real from raw materials and having it hold. Boyd was there. He found her in the back and said, "Boss is here." She said, "I know." She hadn't told Douglas where she was going that evening. She'd told him dinner was in the refrigerator. He found her 40 minutes later, standing at the serving table, helping cut the last of the pies. She watched his face cross the room, the particular way his expression shifted when he encountered something he hadn't anticipated. He was not a man who was easily surprised, and so surprise on his face looked strange, like a coat that didn't quite fit. He stood at the edge of the serving area for a moment. Then he walked over to where Linda Marsh was stacking empty pie plates and said, "Did my wife do this?" Linda looked at him. Linda was not a woman who softened things. "She did," Linda said. "Her and Patrice and me planned it in 3 weeks, 200 people. You want to know what the president of the Historical Society said to me 20 minutes ago?" Douglas said nothing. Linda said it anyway. She said it was the best catered dinner this event has had in 10 years, and she asked if Iris would consider doing it again next year. Douglas was quiet for a long moment. Iris kept cutting pie. He didn't say anything to her that night. They drove home separately. She'd taken the truck. He'd come in his own. And by the time she got back to the ranch, it was nearly 11, and she was tired in a way that went down to her bones. She put the borrowed equipment in the mudroom to be returned in the morning and washed her hands and went to stand at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at the dark. She heard his boots on the porch. He came in and stood in the doorway for a moment. She didn't turn around. "How much did they pay you?" he said. "Enough to cover 3 months of the Wellman lease," she said, "if you can find someone who'll agree to a short-term arrangement." The silence behind her had a different quality than the usual silences. She couldn't have said exactly how, only that it did. "When did you?" He stopped. "September," she said. "The bread started in September." She heard him pull out a chair. She turned around then, because she wanted to see his face, and what she saw was not what she'd been bracing for, not dismissal, not the careful recalibration of someone trying to minimize, but something rawer than that. Something that looked, if she was honest, like a man looking at something he'd been wrong about for a long time, and knowing it. "I didn't know you were doing all this," he said. "You didn't ask," she said. "Not unkind. Just true." He looked at his hands on the table. "I owe you an apology." She sat down across from him. "You owe me several." A sound came out of him that might, in another man, have been a laugh. "I know." She didn't let him off easy. She wasn't built for that, and she didn't think it would do either of them any good. Over the next few evenings, in the kitchen, at the table, in the small hours when the ranch was quiet, and there was nothing to do but talk, she said things she'd written down in her notebook, and some things she hadn't. She told him what it had felt like to hear Margaret's name used the way he'd used it. She told him that she had never asked him to forget his first wife, had never wanted that, but that she was his wife now and she needed him to see her. Not Margaret, not some idea of what a ranch wife should be, but her. He listened. He didn't defend himself, which she respected. He said, "More than once. I know. You're right." On the fourth evening, she made the lamb stew, the one from her grandmother's notebook, the one he'd called too complicated. She set it on the table and sat down and said, "Tell me what you actually think." He tasted it. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned by now to read. "It's the best thing I've eaten since I don't know when," he said. She said, "I know." She did the founder's dinner again the following February and the year after that. By the second year, she had a proper arrangement, a small catering operation, licensed and official, running out of a commercial kitchen she rented 2 days a week in Harlan. She kept the standing orders with the Copper Post and added 2 more restaurants. The red ledger had been replaced by actual accounting software, which she had learned to use with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The bread she still made at home. Douglas drove the delivery route on Tuesday mornings when he could, which was most Tuesdays. He'd started doing this quietly without announcement, about 4 months after the founder's dinner. He didn't make a thing of it. He just showed up in the kitchen on Tuesday mornings and said, "What needs to go in the truck?" She told him. He loaded it. They drove. Some Tuesdays they talked the whole way. Some they didn't. She found over time that she had stopped keeping score of the silences. Not because they'd stopped mattering, they still could, but because she'd gotten better at reading which silences were which, and because she had enough other things filling her days that his quiet no longer felt like a verdict on her worth. The Wellman situation resolved itself in a way no one had predicted. Gerald Wellman's son lasted 1 season trying to run the land himself, and then approached Douglas about a new long-term lease. Douglas negotiated it down to a price that worked, and Iris sat in on the meeting because by then it was understood without discussion that she was part of what happened at this ranch. She didn't say much in the meeting. She didn't need to. The numbers she'd built were in the room with her, and they said enough. Boyd, who had watched all of it from a polite distance and with the careful expression of a man who knows better than to comment, said to her afterward, in the mudroom quietly, "You did good, Iris." She said, "We did all right." He smiled. "You did." There's a photograph from the second founder's dinner that somebody took, and that ended up framed on the wall in the back of the rented kitchen in Harlan. It's a little blurry, taken on a phone across a crowded room, but you can make out Iris in the center of it, in her white apron, laughing at something Patrice has said, a serving spoon in one hand and a dish towel over her shoulder. She doesn't know anyone was taking it. She's not performing anything. It's just her, doing what she does. Douglas saw the photo for the first time when he came to help load equipment after the dinner. He stood in front of it for a while. "That's a good picture," he said. "Patrice said something funny," Iris said. "I meant," he said, and then stopped, and then started again the way he sometimes did, working his way toward a thing at his own pace. "I meant you look like yourself in it." She looked at the photo. She looked at him. "I am myself in it," she said. He nodded once, slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I can see that now." She went back to loading the truck. He helped her carry the heavy pans. Outside, the February air was sharp and cold and smelled like snow coming, and the drive home was quiet in the good way, the kind of quiet that has room in it, that doesn't need to be filled. She drove. He sat beside her. The heater ran. The dark came down over the fields, and Iris Calloway Dunbar, who had walked through a gate carrying her own suitcases on a hot August morning when no one came to meet her, drove home through the dark, with everything she needed already inside the truck.